Hi, everyone. My name is Abdullah Garcia. Today you are here for the session Trust but Verify, Fixing Broken Licensing Compliance in SBOMs. It's a little bit wordy, but we'll get to that. So just a little bit about myself. So I'm a senior lead cybersecurity architect for JP Morgan. I've been in the finance industry for roughly 10 years and in previous industries for about 10 plus years. I have interest in architecture, control design, and whatnot, and neuroscience and a few other hobbies if you ever want to talk about that. Not related, but happy to. And just full disclosure, these opinions are my own and do not represent my firm's work or anything like that, okay? Just to be absolutely clear. Now, also, I want to emphasize, I want this session to be as interactive as possible because I really want you to leave with the sense of like, you got the topic and you are capable to go back to your firm and put action to it, okay? All right, so the agenda for today, we're gonna touch briefly on SBOM, what really matters about them, the financial industry landscape, licensing claims and compliance, can we trust this information, what comes first, component integrity check, limitations, and what next. All right, so first of all, we know kind of like this definition, right? So an SBOM is basically a detailed inventory of components and dependencies in a piece of software, right? We all know that. We have been talking about that for a long time, but it should also be seen as a claim, right? It's basically a claim of that detailed inventory of components, right? Like when you get that from a company, they are claiming that they are giving you that with the package, the software package. So when we speak about SBOMs, what matters? Like what comes to your mind? We typically have completeness. Do we have everything that we need in the SBOM? Is it correct, right? And we think also about provenance and a few other things, right? But at the end of the day, what we're seeking is to establish trust for us, right? Do we trust this software at the end of the day? And if you flip the coin, is basically saying, do I deem this software risky for my business as well, right? So what is the current state in the financial industry landscape? The reality is that we don't get verifiable attestations of the SBOM provenance. We only get the SBOM at best, right? There is no standard, like common standard to establish what means a complete SBOM or a correct SBOM in any way, right? Nor the practices. And furthermore, we have regulatory mandates like SEBI, CSCRF, that's kind of like the name of the law, right? That expect the financial institutions to manage these SBOMs and to know how to deal with them. Any questions about this? No? So far so good? All right. So, on the left-hand side, we have a list of what we would call essential fields in an SBOM. I would like you to think about essential fields and desirable fields. Essential fields are the ones that you really need to do what you need to do with the SBOMs. And in this case, this is not like the full list, but you can think about component name, component version, component identity assertion, component digital fingerprint, aka the hash, and the component license, which is what we're talking about today, right? And if you look at it, this is a call out specifically on Cyclone DX, where you have BOM metadata component licenses, which is basically saying at the high level, this SBOM belongs to a specific software. What are the licenses tied to that software? And then BOM component licenses, basically the dependencies and the licenses on those dependencies. Now, on the right-hand side, you have a very massive spread of the type of licenses that you can encounter for software, right? You have very permissive licenses, right, like Apache, BSD, MIT, or more restrictive and also called strong copyleft, okay? So, questions about that? No? Everyone agrees that we have this situation, we have a bunch of essential fields, and we need to do something about this. So, this is where things are a little bit tricky, right? Because in a very negative scenario, the licensing claims in the SBOM are either missing or incorrect. But equally, you could have a situation where the component claims are incorrect, which render whatever other information about the component incorrect. Does that make sense? Everyone following? So what are the consequences? We have legal risk, IP violations, and security concerns. Even though we typically assume that, okay, well, we're handed over an SBOM, we're trusting the provider, we still have some responsibility, right? Therefore, we do need to do something about this. So, to establish that, right, we need to kind of like identify correctly the component. For that, we get a name and a version, but also an identity assertion. That's to say, for example, Perl ID, right, which basically will map you to npm com dot, I don't know, apache dot whatever, and that's the name of your component, and that's the version, and you can actually verify it, right? And you have a digital fingerprint, typically stored in the package managers, which basically is a hash. Questions about this?
Yeah, what is the identity assertion? I didn't know.
Sorry?
What is the identity assertion?
The identity assertion is basically a validation of the identity of the component that's being described. And we typically, depending on the standard, you would typically allude to Perl links. But that Perl helps when you have like a package manager, right? But it's not like holistic. You will have other type of identity assertions as well. And that will vary depending on the standard as well that you are using for SBOM declaration. Any other question about this? No? All right. On. Okay, so component integrity check. Maybe it's not as clear, but it's one side. So we have a package, right? We have the name, regenerator runtime, right? We have a version here, which is 0.13.6. And then we have an identity assertion, in this case Perl, right? And it's saying, well, this package is the same package that lives in NPM under regenerator runtime version 0.13.6, okay? And then you have here, if you can see this long text, that's basically saying hashes, you have an algorithm, SHA-512, and then the content, the value of the hash, right? And then if you go to that link, you should be able to find this version, and that hash should match what's being described. Should, technically, right? So, again, what happens if the name and the version and this identity assertion are not actually kind of like matching? Do you still trust what's left of the description of the package, i.e. the licenses? Would you? Any questions about this? No? So this makes sense. Because typically, we take it for granted, right? Like we assume. Now, what you're seeing here is basically a command, the terminal, right? And what I'm doing is I'm using npm, the package manager, the CLI. I'm using the command view, and I want to pull out basically the hash for that library, and basically that's stored within the package manager in itself. So that's what you are getting here, right? And what you're seeing this is basically saying the Bob is a base 64 encoded hash, right? Because that's into the actual hash, and if you see it, and you can later take the slides, you can compare, and basically everyone? So here also it gets a little bit tricky, right? So someone asked me about identity assertions, and I discussed about Perl. Now, Perl has its own kind of like repository in GitHub, and you should be able to find this information. This is basically a strip out of that, right? But you can see that, yeah, the link is over there, github.com, package URL, Perl spec, blob master, Perl types. You have Maven, you have NPM, PyPy, Gem, NuGet, GitHub, and so on and so forth, okay? Right-hand side is basically an example of some code in the following. It's validating the hash. And what it's doing is It's downloading the component and use this to compute the hash and to do the check. Now, this is not to say that this is how you should do it, right? This is just an example. Can someone tell me how this can kind of like vary? Or can you think about something, a reason? This is kind of like an interesting question. Can you think of a reason why a hash might not match the registry in the declaration of an SBOM? And how would that turn into an alert for you? Or why would it matter? First of all, if it's not matching hash, that's to say that it's not the same open source component. Right? First of all, a reason for that might be just simply because someone decided to download the repository, compile the system they had, right, and label it as exactly the same version, but it's not, right? And they might have modified the code. So you don't know that, but you should care for that, right? Another one is because someone actually injected something in the pipeline, SolarWinds, and this doesn't match, right? So those are reasons why you care, and these actually ripples down into the whole part of like, okay, the license, is it valid, is it not valid? Do I need to actually go back and care about it, right? Any questions about what I just said? Yes?
So basically these hashes not matching, is it this whole strategy, is it a way to prevent someone from kind of impersonating your project?
It should be something that should alert you that whatever the manufacturer of the software and the supplier of the SBOM, which might be different or might be the same, there's a discrepancy on what they're saying, right? And there might be reasons for that. It might be as well that whatever tool they're using to actually create the SBOM is not actually working correctly, right? And it's not computing the hash. But you have a responsibility because it has an impact on modified software under a license that they actually introduced. What are the consequences for you as a finance institution, right? Everyone good with that? Does that answer your question? Yeah? Awesome. Okay, so what are the limitations about this integrity check topic? So you won't be able to do the integrity check if you don't have the components needed for the integrity check. We discussed already name, version, identity assertion. If you don't have that, you won't know where that came from, right? And you need the hash as well, right? So obviously, if you are dealing with third-party software, which we always deal with, right, as well, you won't be able to do that if you have that hash that you can actually map to do that reference check. Does that make sense? Questions about that? No? Okay. I think I'm on time. I mean, it might be a little bit too fast, but hopefully it's make. And maybe I'll actually take that time to talk a little bit through the next steps as well. So an SBOM does not provide information about the origins, build environments, or modification history of the components, which are crucial to determine trust via traceability and security assurance. What this basically says is we don't have the provenance as part of the process, the provenance of the SBOM, like the information that we need to attest that the SBOM that we're being provided with comes from actually the building pipeline that created that component, right? That's what it says. And regulators haven't actually matched up to that, right? Right now we're still on the topic, give us an SBOM, we need an SBOM, et cetera, right? This is why a lot of people disqualify SBOMs as being useful. And I would actually argue back on that, and I'll explain that, right? So this is basically enter provenance attestation, right? Now, yeah, so again, this is just a reference, right? Like provenance, where it comes from, attestation, what is attestation, signed metadata basically, and yeah, what I said, right? Like, so having provenance attestation increases trust on the SBOM and overlap by verifying the origin and history of the component, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Now, this is tricky, of course, right? Because from third-party perspective, you won't be able to find someone that's keen to be so transparent about their processes. When it's open source, you will find it because they're going to be using pipelines like GitHub Actions or whatnot, right? To actually compile the software, and you're going to see the evidence there. And we already have libraries that actually publish to SIG-Store and whatnot, right? So you can do this already, but you need to do it, right? Because at the end of the day, without this, you're just taking for granted whatever the SBOM provider is telling you, okay? Now, technically, yeah, this is what I was talking about like the changes and whatnot, right? But the interesting part is as well, right? Is the SBOM still relevant without the? And I would argue, I'm deviating a little bit of the topic of the presentation, but I just want you to get that message as well, right? The answer is yes, right? Because at the end of the day, you have a piece of information that's being provided to you by your supplier, and you can actually identify patterns in that information. Meaning, if, for example, you keep your own kind of like standard of correctness and completeness, and you start asking for the SBOM based on that, right? You can see how much it deviates, and you can start to see how much they change their process to provide, like, for example, if your cadence for providing the SBOM initially is once a year, and then you move it to the next year of maturity, and you reduce it to once on every major release, or once on every minor release, are they able to keep up? Or are they able to actually move with the needle, right? So you can start to understand a little bit their DevSecOps practices. How long does it take them to remediate vulnerability? And how does that reflect on the SBOM? Did they change that component? The SBOM components that are declared, are they kind of like old? Do they kind of like carry some technical debt, right? So whomever says that you cannot actually squeeze value off an SBOM just because there is no provenance, that's not correct. I argue, right? And that's why I'm arguing it. But you need to build on that, right? And the first step is integrity checks. And your definition of correctness and completeness. Questions? Because that's pretty much it. Yeah, assess whether the SBOM should be trusted, verify the integrity of the components, check license compliance. Any questions? Yes?
You may have covered it, so sorry, but when's the best time to generate this stuff?
Build time.
On every build?
Huh?
On every build?
Yeah.
And how do you, because we're wondering whether we scan source code and do it passively against the source code when it's not necessarily a build artifact, or whether you do it on the pipe supervisor.
It all depends on your dependency management strategy, right? You could argue that, for example, for critical components for your business, you might want to actually build from source, right? You won't download basically from online, right? You download the source, you do static scanning perhaps, right? You do whatever you need to do, compile, then you put that, and then you build our software, right? But we're speaking about dependencies here. So it really comes down to your dependency management strategy.
So sorry, just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
So if the buyer's source code today's more about the pre-built packages out in the public domain, can you talk around if I would apply it to my source code and then, because that's what I'm sort of more interested
Sorry,
in.
maybe I'm missing the point. Your source code as in the component that you are creating, or
Yeah.
the source code of the dependency that you're consuming?
Well, both, but more my source code. So my source code will have my proprietary source code, but also a bunch of dependencies and transitive dependencies.
Yep.
We're getting a handle on that probably before it becomes a binary artifact with
Yep.
properties baked in. I think is useful to us. So we're curious how we get the two, how they interplay and what we do.
I think I'm happy to follow up after the conversation, but I think that you are kind of like alluding to your steps in your building pipeline, right?
Probably.
Yeah. Okay, I'm happy to take it, but yeah, normally any scanning that results in basically change on the code, right? Out of a trigger, then you might as well be off better kind of like create less one after the changes, right? Any other question? Yes.
What's the best way to share SBOMs?
What's the worst way to share this one? Great
I mean,
question.
to trust the way, right? Because like you were talking about integrity, and okay, I may have a component updated somewhere, but the same way I can have a SBOM modified. I mean, just full transparency. I'm the guy behind chain open source project for SBOMs and attestations, but yeah, I would love to see how do we envision the future. Like, how do people share SBOMs in 2026?
So I would argue that a lot of SBOM sharing has been placed in SIG-Store, right? Like you literally, you go to ChainGuard, you can actually pull the SBOM from SIG-Store altogether, work them up and consume it. And it's in SPDX format if I recall correctly. Now, from a third-party perspective, it might be the case that whomever you're giving the SBOM to, they might prefer actually submission to API. Why? Because the thing about relying on kind of like, the whole process of providing an SBOM also speaks to the identity that's provided it to you, right? Because we are touching on kind of like who's signing the SBOM. That's not being tampered with. It's not only kind of like who created it, like who is signing it to say this is our SBOM, right? So there might be a need for identity kind of like validation, right? Like let's say X company is consuming your software, right? And they want to know for sure which identity is actually signing the SBOM, and they have like you come into an agreement of which identity is that one, right? Any SBOM that they receive from other identity is deemed not valid, right? But also kind of like it puts a little bit of emphasis on your side of the story to protect the identity and the credentials for that identity. Now we're speaking about, is this maturity level to the point where you actually have identities that are human identities, or you actually have maturity enough to have non-human identities doing the signature? Okay? Does that answer the question? Roughly?
Yeah, we'll see how it goes, right? Because we often see that the SBOMs are very often shared in SharePoints or...
Yeah, okay, so we're speaking about format now. So if we're speaking about format, then choose your kind of like SPDX or DiagnoDX or for another Metabar? No, I wanted to simplify. Anyway, point is YAML, JSON, not Excel, not SharePoint, nor PPTX or anything like that. If it's gonna be to the SharePoint platform, right? Then it might as well work so long as the pipeline can actually consume it. Because think about it this way: when you receive the SBOM, what are you gonna do with it? What's the first thing that you will do with it?
I mean, it depends. I can, for instance, consume it in, let's say, the dependency track. I want to analyze it for vulnerabilities and open source license compliance.
Right? Okay. So it needs to go into a pipeline, right?
Correct.
Okay. If you can do that from SharePoint and put it into a pipeline, then great, right? But it's a tool choice. And sorry, I deviated, I misunderstood. I heard SharePoint and I thought about different formats. That was my mistake. But
it's more about
yeah.
How does it look like today, and how do we want to hold people at enterprises in the future to do it the right way, the secure way.
It's because I genuinely don't think that there is necessarily, when we say secure, we need to say one way. So we need to speak about properties of the ways that we do things, right? When we do identity checks on the delivery, is data in transit secure, etc., etc. Yes. Oh, sorry. Anyone else? Okay, it's almost 5 minutes beforehand. And thank you for your time. This was insightful. Well,